life change. Oh, and we're recording. Yeah.
Sorry.
No worries. So I was off to South Africa to the UN negotiations and to meet this group of countries, the least developed countries. They are 46 countries that are classified by the UN as the world's poorest. And in the climate negotiations, they work together as a bloc. So they span really different politics. The countries, 34 of them are in Africa. The rest are in Southeast Asia, Pacific Island states, and then the one nation in the Americas is Haiti. And at the time I started in the climate negotiations in 2011, the Gambia was chairing this group. The Gambia is a small country in the west of Africa. It's actually the smallest country in continental Africa. And they were the chair. They were the country convening this group of countries. And I got to work really closely with this delegation from 2011 to 2015, which during the UN climate negotiations was the we were negotiating what would become the Paris Agreements, the first universal legally binding climate treaty the world has had. Being there and that space for that was a huge moment for the world, for me. My colleagues and I had been dropped into I had been dropped into the space as a student. I had to learn, and readers learn through my stories, what the UN negotiations are like in real life, the people behind all of these national positions, how they come together, make decisions, who represents who, and what they're really fighting over and trading off about, and see the process that it took to get to this agreement. By 2015, still really didn't know that we were going to form the treaty, and we did. It was incredible. And my colleague who I was sat next to in plenary had been flirting with the cameraman all day. So we were front page news because our pictures were on the paper, which was fun. But yes, huge moment. The least developed countries group had much to celebrate in this treaty. And we were also overwhelmed at the possibility of what we had agreed. And then 2016 happened, which for me, as an American, was devastating on a number of levels. Obviously, President Trump made good on his campaign promise, pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement swiftly, and I had to go to work every day and look my colleagues in the eye, knowing that my country, the biggest emitter, had reneged again on its promises. And would no longer be bringing down our emissions, but also we would not fulfill our financial pledges to the least developed countries and others to adapt to the climate crisis and to implement new technology that would help them develop in a more sustainable way. So in particular, the group of folks I was working with were relying on the US to fulfill its pledges, and we weren't going to anymore. And I was so devastated. And one of the things it pushed me to do was to write this, because I just so wanted more Americans to be able to connect with the people who go to the UN climate negotiations and what they're fighting for, with so many of my colleagues, and what we experience every day, but also the reasons why I in particular am so gripped by the climate crisis, and I think why others who I work with are so gripped. And for me, that had to do with something that was really personal, but also different than most people might think. So I grew up in a violent household. My father was violent, and I was pretty terrified of him growing up. And I remember learning about the climate crisis as a 19-year-old. I didn't know about climate change until I went to undergrad. And so I had a panic attack in the lecture hall where I heard about it because it was new information to me, and I had left my father's house and was off to make my safe, stable future where I could make my own decisions and control my own money and make my own way. And suddenly the world wasn't safe again. We were all living in this terrifying environment in this unsafe way that would take, particularly for people who look like me, the futures we wanted away again. And I knew, from essentially the moment I stopped hyperventilating, that I was A, needed to know more about the climate crisis, but B, needed to do something about it. And that for me fueled the shift away from this set path of becoming an architect to something that was different, because I had to protect my own future, but also the people I loved from this threat that so reminded me of the house I grew up in. And the more I got into the UN climate negotiations and saw the power dynamics behind that, the more parallels I saw. So again, I worked for 46 poorest countries on Earth. They emit about 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and they are 5 times more likely to die in climate-enhanced natural disasters. Like the injustice of watching them push and push for international solutions to this, only to have people in positions of power, countries like ours, make promises and then walk away from them, reminds me of my dad, if I'm honest. Like, reminds me of this terribly abusive and unfair power dynamic where violence is inevitable and only a matter of time, and those least responsible are going to have the most inflicted on them. And so much of like the way we in America in particular, I now live in London, and so I've been living outside the US for 8 years now. And the way we talk about the climate crisis in America, we don't talk about the power dynamics. We don't talk about like the inherent injustice between what we emit and what others emit, and the fact that we make pledges and back out. We're constantly blaming other people. So much of that is so similar to an abusive household. Like, if you stop and think about it, and we like to pretend when things really aren't safe, and we don't want to own up to kind of the reality and the role that our continued silence about this and our continued inaction plays in its perpetuation. And as I wrote the book, like, I just wanted a different lens on how we talk about climate, particularly like this big issue and this big international process that is plenty flawed, but just wanted a bit of a more human experience of that. And as I did that, I'm winding down, but as I did that, I kind of, it also, in writing about my dad and in writing about my colleagues and what motivates us, it did more and more point me towards why we were doing this. And for me, it came back to this real want to protect the people I love, to protect my family and my friends, and more my colleagues, and the futures we all want to have for ourselves and for our families. And yeah, this did become a love story for me in the end. This is about my mom and my childhood best friend, and the friends and roommates and connections I've made over the course of my life, and how precious they are to me, and what I want to do to protect them, and what I think we all need to do and want to do to protect the people we love, because truly that is what is behind so much of our climate action, is this real desire to protect each other. So I have written this memoir as a love story, and that's it in a nutshell. I'll stop talking there because there's a lot to dive into, but thank you for giving me the space to just tell that bit of a story and have a conversation about all the different ways we come into it. But yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming.
So let me tell you all what's going to happen so that you can be informed. So Danny and I are going to have a conversation with Brianna, and then we're going to invite you into the conversation. How's that sound?
Sounds great.
All right. So Danny, did you want to start or shall I? When did you start? Okay. So one of the things when I read your book was the macrocosm for what is happening here in Providence as the microcosm, right? So when you talk about least developed countries, what I think are low wealth communities, right? And when you start talking about investments or lack thereof, or the people who make the least contribution to pollution, or are the people who suffer the most from the injustice, I think about why REJC came into being, right? And the challenges that were probably gut-wrenching and devastating to you in 2016, I would say, are the things that fueled us to create this document called the Climate Justice Plan, right? So we have here one of the brainchildren of who put REJC into being, because REJC was looking at eco-municipalities. And how can we do that here in the loveliness of this northeastern state of Providence? But you can't just make that happen when you have a community that you're trying to engage, and the community has been so harmed by policy, right? So REJC idea that comes out of the Office of Sustainability, and community engagement comes in, and community says, we don't trust you, you lie. And even when you say you're not lying, if you're talking your mouth, you're lying, right? And what then, you know, after 3.5 years of working, trying to figure out, talking with our neighbors, this wonderful document is created called the Climate Justice Plan. And it really was a wonderful document, right? However, the people who were in charge of saying, oh, yes, we're going to adopt it were, oh, I didn't read it. Oh, what are we talking about? Because the idea of bringing justice into a conversation around the environment is something that people still don't really want to talk about, because what are we talking about? The isms, racism, sexism, classism, right? And when it finally was adopted by the city of Providence, everybody, and when I say everybody, I mean everybody, wanted to take a piece of it, right? Because it was such a thing that the city could say, oh, look at this thing. And now we are in the process of how do we indemnify it? How do we create laws and policy around it? And baby, when I tell you it's a thing, it's a thing. So my question is, you don't actually talk into those in the book, but how does race, class, and gender play into the power dynamics of the work that you did?
Yeah, and so much of what you're saying, that whole kind of sequence of events, like that plays out at the international level all the time. Like, so the most recent iteration is that the UN climate negotiations are now grappling with what's known as loss and damage. So basically owning up to the fact that we have irrevocably changed and lost things because of the climate crisis. And for like the small island states are real proponents of this, but as are the least developed countries. For a classic example, which is very sad that I'm having to say classic example, but small island states, because of sea level rise, are losing territory. And then low-lying states like the Gambia, which is a river delta, as the salt water rises, the water in the delta becomes more and more saline. You can plant crops in fewer and fewer places. Because the country is so small, there's nowhere, you can't move out of the delta. And so basically the viability of their agriculture decreases every year. It is only a matter of time before they will not be able to live in the places they live. And so this concept of introducing ideas, bringing them to the table for discussion, people really wanted to take a bunch of pictures at like progressive agreement time and then absolutely do nothing to do the work that we have said we have done. Is describing a cycle that we're all too familiar with. And I think the thing about framing things with a justice perspective is, of course, that inherently means that you are agreeing that some people have done more than others to cause the problem and are more responsible for the problem. And it means that in order to create just solutions, you have to change the power dynamic about who gets to make decisions going forward. And people with power do not want to do that, which plays out internationally, it plays out nationally, it plays out in a home. Like the power struggle is real. And I think in the UN climate negotiations, the wealth talks, they are the least developed countries. The countries I work with, they bring the fewest people to the sessions because they do not have the finances to bring hundreds of people. The US delegation is 300 people. They all have Ivy League degrees, and of course their native language is English, and of course they've been studying this forever. Like what the governments I support are up against is just so ridiculously there's such a gap. For example, when I started in 2011, the Gambian delegation had 4 people in it, which is why they needed an assistant. And yeah, like money talks, also the gender aspect I find is so, we could talk about that for a long time. I work in environmental studies, have done for over a decade now. Most of my colleagues are women, and then we get to the table and everybody making decisions are men. And of course they don't match what we've said that we need and what we need to be agreed. And it is so frustrating to see this play out internationally, nationally, locally, in a house, etc. Like having a justice framing also needs to rebalance the scales in terms of men and women power dynamics. And to be honest, the fact that in the environmental space, women need much more space to be making decisions, big ones and small ones, and everything in between. And then you said something else that I wanted to jump onto, but I've forgotten because I've been talking for so long. But yeah, like there's so many of these elements play out in so many levels. If we're really going to change things, we need to delve into breaking the power dynamics and the systemic dynamics that go into these imbalances and injustices, and draw more attention to those and focus then on changing how we move things forward, because we get stuck on all the same things. And definitely comes into the picture too. It's a bit of a different system at the UN, but because it's one of the few spaces I've ever been in where it's a minority white space, because the globe is minority white, but still white supremacy finds its way there too. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Go. So that's great. So how do I get into this? Okay, so I'm a family medicine, social medicine physician. And I talk about the social determinants of health. So that's where we live, learn, work, and play. So where we live is, our neighborhoods, our community, our housing. Where we learn is, a lot of time determined about where we live. Where we work, we can see from COVID who gets the most impacted, who gets the least paid, and who gets the most impacted. And where we play, in terms of our environment and what green space is about. So as a clinician, I got out of the clinical space because I felt like by the time people came to see me, that it was late and that we have to do something to change the conditions that create these processes, right? And so I'm always I try to take a 30,000-foot view, and then sometimes I come down to earth. Sometimes. So what I find in the book, I'm talking about environment, is violence. You mentioned the violence, and we have talking about structural violence, all the isms, and then how they create conflict, and then trickle down to create those interpersonal conflicts. So we're understanding systems and trying to figure out how we undo the centuries of damage, right? What are the laws that are made that created the conditions that we're in, and then how to undo them. Yeah. But understanding it from the sense of what are those power dynamics that reinforce it and refuse to give up power, and how we have to change that. Right? So I read that and see that in the book over and over again when you see the most powerful countries talking about like what we're going to do, and then they renege. But this is a pattern we see all the time, right? We understand that the most vulnerable are always the most impacted, but the truth is we're all impacted. Yeah. The toxicity that is created by maintaining these systems poisons us all. And there is a point where people start to understand that we're all poisons. So one of the things that I do, if we're talking about housing, right? And that's another way that I looking at zoning,
looking at environmental justice in our communities is another replication, but it's by design. Why we were segregated and who gets dumped on, literally, right, is by design. And the grassroots movements, the people's movement that changed and put environmental racism and environmental justice on the map, so that we're having a conversation about this today. And so what happens a lot of times is people don't want to talk about environmentalism seems to miss that mark of the injustices that are replicated in our own communities all the time, and misses the mark of those intersections of how the most vulnerable continue to be extracted, having systems of extraction, and those in power want to maintain it. So with that, so that when I'm talking about and teaching about housing and the legacy of the design of creating segregated, polluted communities, then I see the replication of what's happening on the world scene. So have you been able to make that connection with what's happening in our own communities here in the state, and then how that plays out on the world scale?
I also want to piggyback on that question. How do you feel about the term climate change? Now go.
Climate change is not my favorite term.
Okay.
It is what we use in the discussion, but we should call it something else. We should call it crisis. We should call it emergency. We should call it violence, which is something I wanted to get to. And I'm personally saddened to draw parallels between growing up in a violent space, but also then watching the harm that we inflict on others through pollution, and it costs lives. The governments I work for go to the UN with a readout of everyone who has died in the last year. This is not, it is violence, and it has a cause that is now more and more attributable. We can say what percentage was caused because of increases in X emission, and we don't talk about it this way, but that's what it is. And actually, a couple weeks, I think it's 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago now, Vanuatu was successful in bringing the first climate case to the International Court of Justice, where we usually try human rights abuses. It's the first time they'll hear a climate case, but it is because Vanuatu will cease to exist because of climate change, and it is. We are not long out now, and so this is for them, this is a war crime. You knew you would cause our obliteration, and you did it anyway. Who can hear us in this space, and recognizing that this is violence, this is a crime against humanity that was perpetrated knowingly. And so perhaps in the international space, we are reaching the place where we're going to talk about that in different words and more openly about the crime that it is. And Vanuatu will just be the first. Several island states have their kind of cases together, and we'll be following for them. And then least developed countries are also talking about coming together with suits and cases like this as well. But yeah, I think you were talking so much about the violence that we see internationally, but that trickles down as well, or just recognizing the same pattern of behavior in different spaces. I see that so clearly in the house I grew up in, the community I grew up in, the nation I grew up in, and now in the international space that we inhabit. These power dynamics run wild in all the places we are. How do we break those? How do we call those out? And how do we reshift power to have less violence and built into our systems? It's the work before all of us, I think, that we have want to tackle in so many different ways.
Okay, we're gonna come for you. So there were two things that came out in the book that I really appreciated. I appreciated the sanctity and the divinity of prayer that you put in there. I was like, yeah.
And not talking about God and climate change. People do not like connecting those things.
Listen, I was all in it. I was there with you. I was like, come on, show who you are. And then the fact that you called it a love story, not once, not twice, but several times just in this room, and then thinking about my own process of how
I get to do the work of environmental justice. Honestly, and this is also what I say, it's the worst work. Y'all know, it is the worst work that you could ever do. I'm looking right at you. But for me, it was a call, right? And it was a clarion call. And it was a call just like how I was called to preach. It was a call just how I was called to serve. And I continue to be like, okay, God, these are your people. I don't even really like them, right? I don't even really like them. And yet, here we are. So I want to know, how does faith come into the work that you do? And how does love come into the work? Because it's thankless.
Or it can be, yeah, for sure.
Don't blame me.
And-
I know. I'm glad.
Thank you for asking about faith and prayer and God.
One today.
Love it. Yeah, well, this is a memoir, so it is me. And I, yes, was one of those girls who went to Christian school, and my mom taught our Sunday school class, and then I went home to be beaten by my father. So, you know, complex. Faith has been part of my life for the duration of my life. And I find these days great solace and great joy in my relationship with the divine. And I know many of my colleagues feel the same. It is not unusual to hear people praying in the United Nations, because if anybody needs prayer.
How about it?
Like, and I loved bringing God into a climate memoir because I see so many things about the Christian framing, particularly in America, that is so anti-climate, anti-environment, anti-anything to do with protecting any kind of natural space. Not natural space, the people who live and rely on natural space.
That's
Exactly.
That's it.
Like, and I don't understand the disconnect and why we continue to perpetuate this. Like, and I am mixed. My mother is white and her people are white, and my father is black and his people are black. And like the way Christianity plays out is so different amongst these spaces. And I really just wanted to bring my prayer life about climate change and climate justice into this story as a way of just showing people that all these things can and are connected. And I too feel a similar draw to this area, I think, because of the narratives of kind of forgiveness and restoration that are so important to my Christianity, and my relationship with God, that also give me hope for the kind of story we could tell or could rewrite about our relationship with each other and our shared home. We can change things if we want. We can right wrongs that have been so entrenched. And we can find joy and connection with each other in a way that is not violence. And that for me, and the love too, the overwhelming love I believe my creator has for me, but also that he has for everyone else who occupies this planet, and how seeing that is, for me, the fuel that drives a lot of this work that doesn't get praised and appreciated, like convening, organizing, all the work I know you guys are interested in too, but does speak to our human connection, how much love we have for each other, and making the best possible future that we can. And yeah, I think we need a more authentic prayer and relationship with each other, but also with the divine. And just, yeah, more love infused conversations across levels would really, really make this work more bearable and more doable and more achievable, in my opinion. And yeah.
So, okay, go ahead, because you know I have something else. Go, if you don't go, I will.
So my question really, because I go back to, you know, hearing when you're thinking about the tension between Christianity and how there isn't anywhere where there's, really an understanding about the relationship to the land, right? And then how that is plays out in power dynamic that continues that framework of that all is there just for us to extract and use for our own benefit.
Yeah, the way we interpret the world is yours and the fullness thereof is like mine. It's like, no.
Right, so how do we get in where we are, some of us, always understanding from our roots and our ancestry that we are in relationship with land, and that we need to give as well when we're taking, right? And in order to maintain the balance and the wellness, which is, I think, we would all agree that we're seeing is what's wrong, right? What's happening is that it's being destroyed. Right? So how do you think and reconcile that idea of like, how do we make that shift to have us start really relating, to be in relationship, having that relationship? Do you think that, go.
Yeah, no, and I feel so fortunate to work with people I do because I get to see this modeled out in different places than America, which is nice. And so, for example, like 2 chairs ago, the LDC group was chaired by the country of Bhutan. Bhutan's kingdom in the Himalayas, and they are carbon neutral. Like the whole country, they are small, they have really increased their forest cover, they rely on hydropower, but like there are ways of being in this world that don't have to cause the runaway emissions that we think is so inherent to our way of life. And Costa Rica is like another model. There are some island states who are really forward thinking on this. Like there are different ways of being that exist right now. Yes, America has a big hurdle to jump because we have tooled our economy one way and we need to change it, but we also have more resources than anybody else to do that. Like, and I just so wish we would take our attitude that we could put a man on Mars and we could do whatever we want to other spaces. Like, if we want to talk about American exceptionalism, perhaps we should apply it here. But yeah, like there certainly are different ways of relating to the land, the atmosphere, that have been modeled on societal scales already that we could point ourselves towards. And yeah, it's to our detriment that we don't. And I wish that occupied more airtime in the American conversation, was not just all how much it would cost us to do, but like the examples that are already exist in terms of what can be done. Yeah.
All right, so here I go. So when I listen to you talk, I think about how our EJC works. We are, what I like to talk about is we are run by the people who are perceived to live in the margins, and the way that we understand ourselves, we are centered, right? So in the center of the leadership are women. In the center of the leadership are queer, gender non-conforming. In the center of the leadership, we lead because mothers have children, right? Because the work is really tough. So we don't work a 5-day week because we work 5 days in 2 days, right? And so that makes it hard for us to interact with the rest of the world because that's not how they understand themselves. But for us, what we decided after the bumps of trying to make our EJC a thing was we needed to really focus on ourselves as ourselves, not the work, the justice work, because justice work will kill you. And so we want to be well, right? And you have to, and people are laughing at the way that I'm phrasing things, but I think you have to be able to call racism, sexism, misogyny, classism, because if you don't use that language and the specificity of those things, then people can say climate change and talk about it ethereally as if it's going to happen like it hasn't already happened, right? And you know, humans are a funny thing. When you start to name the thing and understand the emergency that is happening, then all of a sudden something goes, aha, we didn't get snow this winter.
Yeah. And meanwhile, Washington State has never had more snow. Like, it's snowing right now. It's
Okay.
bizarre. Like,
No, that's not bizarre, right? Exactly, right? And so those of us who know better are supposed to say,
Mhm.
right? We're supposed to speak things that are not as though they were, but or are. I lost my train of thought, I'm sorry. When you think about on the national stage and you talk about Bhutan and you talk about Costa Rica, where are the places where a just formation could actually be a way by which the UN can say, all right, y'all want to do this seriously? Then let's be serious. Let's call the thing. Let's stop acting like we don't have all the data that we will ever have a need for. We know what this is. So let's actually do that.
Yeah.
Am I making sense in the question?
Yeah, well, there's a lot there, but I think, and this was something I wrote about as well, because I went into the UN climate negotiations with so much hope. I was like a young student, I was gonna go to the UN, we were gonna have the answers, we were gonna negotiate this treaty, it was gonna be amazing. And we did negotiate a treaty. It does rely entirely on political will. Every country gets to make their pledge every 5 years, and they are supposed to then make new pledges after that that are an advancement from their last pledge. But of course, they can pull out whatever they want. There's no criminal court that's going to take them to task. We are going to incrementally make progress, but it's not going to be as nearly as fast enough as we would need to avert the worst of the climate crisis. And for the countries I work with, even the finance and other things that were pledged are going to trickle in at whatever rate the individual countries want. So yeah, thinking that the UN, to look to the UN was going to solve the climate crisis is flawed. It is the only place that least developed countries and small island states have a seat at the table, which is why I continue to do the work that I do, because they are not invited to the G20, the G7, the UN Security Council. Those places are held by superpowers. They are not going to open themselves up anytime soon. And I do think a lot about what a just system for decision-making at an international level about climate change in particular looks like. Because the one we have isn't going to get us to solutions quickly enough, but it remains the only place where the countries I work for get to even start of making a final decision. I think the way the world should go about this is that only the least developed countries and the small island states should have seats at the table, and they should decide, and the superpowers should have to implement them. How they get the superpowers to do that, I have no idea. They're superpowers, and they tend to do what they want. But yes, like there is so much room to improve the way we come together as the planet and make decisions about the crisis, and then hold countries to account for that. The Paris Agreement does have a compliance mechanism, but essentially the only thing countries have agreed to is to pledge. They haven't actually agreed to do what they've said. And so then compliance just looks at, if you haven't pledged, we can name and shame you. But of course, that's not, we're talking about the climate crisis. That is not going to get us where we need to go. And so things internationally are just so weak and so reliant on the political will of each country, that really, for countries like the countries I work for, it is not going to, it's still their best place, but it's not the best solution. It's a long ways from that. Yeah, so we've got a lot of work there.
Okay, so I want to ask one more question and I'm going to open it up to y'all. So what does hope look like? So we talked about love. How does hope? What does hope look like?
Yeah, that is Great question. Some days my answers are better than others on that question. I do continue to find a lot of hope in basically the work. I continue to be moved by the people I work with and how much they have on the line for this and how far they will go to create change for themselves and their families and their entire countries. And for me, like, part of my reasons for writing this was to talk to my fellow Americans about our unique privilege in this space to make change and to basically use our power to shape our American collective response. Like, we should be voting for climate leaders, we should be protesting in action, and we should be divesting and moving our money out of institutions that invest in fossil fuels, and we should do it like our lives and the lives of the people we love depend on it. And we have so much power that my colleagues in the UN would kill for to make change and to make a better future. And so that's the end of my book, is that kind of this call for us as Americans to use our power to shape our collective response in these three big ways. And I know so many of you and so many of us have really done that. And I do look at other big things. I know, like, my dad's side of the family was very involved in the civil rights movement. My granddad marched with Martin Luther King. Like, we have seen big changes in American society that have been very, very hard fought. But I also, like, am so grateful to them. This is kind of my version of the story of that continuing arc towards justice. Because yeah, like, we do have so much power here to make change out of terrible, terrible odds. And I think we should use that in this situation as well. And if we can do it for the advancement of our own civil rights, we can do it for other things. And I, just really do want the future that my colleagues and I are so longing for, working for, and to protect the people I love. So yeah. That's my answer today.
I think that's a good answer. And I also want to just say that when you talk about the civil rights, you are exactly right, because the civil rights movement was moving towards this conversation of climate, right? So that connection is absolutely correct. Thank you so much for allowing us to just come for you.
I love it.
All right. Did you have anything else, Danny, before I send it
As
to
you know, I've been like just waiting to hear what you guys have asked.
Okay.
And what are you sitting there going?
It's a burning question. Okay, please, can you stand up? Yeah, because we want to be able to hear you. And the teacher in me is gonna come out. Who are you?
Okay, so my name is Darlene Gomes, and I came today specifically because you were Black. It's really rare for me to see a person of color talking about climate change, right? So, and I think a lot of you, all of you mentioned like the racism and stuff like that. And I think a big problem that people of color community have is that right now their mind is on survival. Like, all we are worrying about is how to pay our bills. Like, and this is the big thing. People are struggling to pay their bills. And so climate crisis is just like on the bottom of the list of priorities. So how do we help people to understand how important this is when they are like, they're just trying to survive? That's one. And then the other thing is like, when is stuff like this going to be taught at school? Like, when are the kids going to, like, they're our future? Maybe they feel like they have no future if we talk to them about this, but I really feel like they need a connection with nature. If anybody needs a connection with nature, it's our children, especially the children here in urban cities, where the trees are getting cut down all the time. It's just development. There's a piece of land, oh, let's build a house there. I live next to a historical church that it was a historical Black church. Now it's going to be turned into a 15-unit studio. I have my little garden that's going to be next to a 15-car parking lot. So, you know what I'm saying? So there's the disconnection of the neighbor, and then there's the people of color that are struggling to survive. So how do we?
Thank you so much. I'm gonna have part with that, then yeah, happy
Go,
to.
go.
Thank you for saying the thing about being Black and getting to talk about this, because I am not Al Gore or Greta Thunberg. I am not the person who usually gets media attention to talk about climate change for reasons that we all know and all aware of, systemic racism and other places. But the people who get to talk about this are a very privileged few. If for me, it like so doesn't represent the people who are working on this, right? Like the people I know who are most active are people of color, and that certainly on a world scale is so true. And yes, I also really struggled to get this story published for a number of reasons. I'm new to writing, and a climate change memoir is not going to be your beach read and all of that. But there's a reason I ended up at Lawrence Hill Books. They tell underrepresented stories by underrepresented authors. They're a Black press, and they were the ones who were going to take the chance on this. I think there is, particularly in America, just this barrier of talking about climate change if you are not white and went to an Ivy League school. And I really, really wish, I hope I'm making more space for others to talk about it, because we are so often the ones who are doing the work. So thanks for pointing that out.
The ones most affected.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
So comment
so,
on that.
all right, so, well, I
The
think.
three of us.
Well, we talked about it by design, right? It's by design. We can't pretend that it's not by design. And then we also have to think about, how do we change the narrative? Brianna's changing the narrative, right? REJC is changing the narrative. Dr. Dannie Ritchie is changing the narrative. And Movement Education Outdoors, which is a colleague, which works with young people having a relationship to the land in Rhode Island, is changing the narrative, right? But you know, just like people are trying to pay their bills because they think that that's their priority, but let's also flip it around, where those are also the people who are recycling the most. Those are also the people who are not leaving a very large footprint. They are not Cardi on 95, right? So give folks a break, right? They're doing, let's assume that people are doing the best that they can with what they have, right? Let's say that thing. But I know where you live, and I know exactly what's happening, and I try not to lose my mind when I think about how that particular development came into development. But I also think that organizations like REJC are all around the country. And so we have to continue to do what we do. We have to educate, we have to stay on where we are. We have to stay on the journey. It is really not going off, is it? But yeah, when you think about the thing that you can do, like what is the thing that you can do? If you want your child to have a relationship with the land, look up Movement Education Outdoors. That's why I put it on the board, because that's a place where you can go and your child can learn about environmental justice, can learn about indigenous practices, and learn about what is it like to garden and have a relationship with the land. I know it's still going.
I know, because it's an alarm.
Okay.
It's trying to wake me up.
Okay, I thought it was me for a minute, and I'm like, no, it's not you. That's not what yours sounds like.
I would also, the thing about schools and teaching the climate crisis is something I am so passionate about now. Because yeah, like so born and raised in semi-rural America, like this was not part of my K through 12 education. And then I showed up in Seattle, where my peers had learned about this when they were 5 years old. And now I live and work in the UK, and similarly, like the climate crisis is taught in kindergarten. Like they start this education very young, and for urban students, for like it's across the board. And I am just so, and I have relatives who grew up in Texas and grew up in other places, and they still any classes on climate change. But yeah, I do think just the dearth of education in America about this issue is so unjustifiable. Like, why aren't we teaching this, and why isn't this seen as fundamental education? There are reasons, of course, but I started writing to my school district back home in Kelso to be like, this should be on the curriculum. Here are the materials you need to teach this. But yeah, like I'm very angry
So
that
you're
this
gonna
continues to
go-
Yeah.
You're
advance.
gonna go, okay.
You
girl.
know, I'm gonna be,
I
I'm
know,
gonna be
go.
devil's advocate here.
I know.
I'm gonna talk about white spaces.
Yeah, thank you, thank
So
you.
I'm gonna talk about how certain subjects end up being relegated to white spaces. And I think you kind of started touching on that. And so that people don't see the invitation in while they're struggling, to do their everyday survival. Who has room to try to struggle against a place that's been designated as a white space? And that was one of the things that we were talking about, is like, there's 3 Black women up here are talking about these issues, but we're talking about it from a justice perspective. And so sometimes that language has to be from a justice perspective to understand that it's a justice issue, which is again where we get to, like, when we're talking in environmental justice, when we're understanding the relationship between, environmental racism and environmental justice, and how we are acting on the world in general, and that they're one and the same, but their language, and that's where the narrative has to switch, so that we can see how we have that this is some place that we need to be, and figure out how that shift that conversation to it being about climate, which seems like it's in relationship to our everyday life, because it's in the air. It's not about the toxic dump that's next to us and the industrial, plants that continue to pollute, right? And are creating damage, right? And that those of us who live there suffer the most from. So I think that how do we have that conversation that shuts us out, and then starts to create a space that is inviting and opens up to everybody.
I think that that's true, but I also think that, I ran a campaign on environmental justice, and for me, environmentalism doesn't talk about it, because environmentalism is a white space, but it's also not really concerned about how the people really maneuver in the space, right? So when you start talking about the challenge that environmentalism has with EJ, it's because you didn't talk about the least of those. Right? And you didn't incorporate how you were talking about whales, but what about the people who are the Inuit who live there, right? You aren't talking about them. Or if you talk about what's happening in the mountains, yeah, well, don't try to blow up half of the mountain. Do you know what I'm saying? Because there were probably animals and people living there, right? So it has to be a very broad conversation when you talk about these things, and the language. I mean, I said it, the language has to measure the emergency that it really is. Don't get us started. You all have some questions, because y'all won't get in. You're trying to get in. Yes, go ahead, Greg. Stand up.
Mine isn't actually a question, but I'm thinking, listening to y'all about the meeting I'm going to tomorrow. The Commerce Corporation, which is one of my least favorite organizations in the state of Rhode Island, is having a conversation on the climate economy tomorrow. And I just know, and I don't know why I know it, but I know that they're going to basically talk about technologies and, certain kinds of jobs. And the whole issue of the fact that we have to put climate justice at the heart of our economy and our economic development is not going to be on the table, except if I bring it there. And so I'm planning to bring it there, but that's the things that drive them crazy, is because, they have this narrow view of what's acceptable in that space when you're talking about the economy, rather than understanding, even as Thomas Piketty reminded us, equality in the economy is how you get to prosperity. And, I've been saying this for 20 years. I've had it on my business card for 20 years, that, the relationship between ecological health and community health. And so it's kind of like, that's what I'm hoping that more people will do is, I, as a white person, can't talk about racism quite the way you guys can, because you guys have lived it differently than I have. I try to talk about it, but I know that I am probably more effective really nailing them on the economic stuff, because that's almost a language that they know how to hear, but they really don't even dare. So I want to thank you all for stimulating this thought and helping me prepare for tomorrow so I can hopefully represent better.
I want to respond to you, Greg, because here's the thing. It has to come, racism has to come out of the mouths of white people if we are going to eradicate it, right? If we're
Yes.
going to undo it, right? It has to come out because it harms white people too, right? We have to talk about misogyny and sexism out of the mouths of men because it affects men too, right? Because until the power dynamics shift, there's not going to be a change. So thank you for being a pain in the ass, right? Thanks, man.
Tomorrow, the Commerce Corporation has got this consultant. I've read a lot of stuff by the consultant, and it's basically the rich people in the state of Rhode Island and the people who make it are going to try to talk about like moving forward on a better climate economy.
I know exactly what you're talking about. Okay, got it.
And they're just going to take it.
No doubt.
Are there any more questions that anyone has or comments?
There's a young person in our Zoom room
Please.
named Jeremy who says, "What can I do to lower my footprint on Earth?"
You start.
Great. Hi, Jeremy. Thanks for being here, and to everyone online too. And good question, and thanks for your want to lower your footprint. However, I would call out that basically the climate crisis is caused by the systems we have. And so what we need to do is tear down those systems. Incremental changes within the system aren't going to get us to where we need to go as quickly as we need to go. And also just FYI, the tracking your carbon footprint and working to reduce it was a ploy, a stall tactic.
Thank you.
To basically just keep us from focusing on shifting.
Yeah.
So yes, your heart's in the right place, but I would channel your energy and your rage and your wish to change things into reshaping our systems. And I think particularly for Americans, the power you have to vote, protest, and divest are our three biggest things to do. But yeah, there are a lot of amazing groups that you can get involved with here who are working on just those things. But yeah, like thanks for the energy, but we need to tear down the systems themselves rather than incrementally reduce things within them.
We have another question. Yes.
You mentioned.
Stand up. Who are you?
You mentioned.
Excuse me. Tell me who you are.
Brian Wilder.
Thank you.
Climate Action Rep. You mentioned the term climate violence, and I really appreciate putting those together so clearly. And I think in my work, I'm going to use that more as a term. I've stopped using climate change. I think it was the fossil fuel companies that came up with that term because it was less objectionable. But climate violence is a beautiful way to synthesize what's going on.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yeah,
Thank you.
please.
As a comment or question.
Name.
Chris, I'm a psychiatrist and also was raised as a Quaker, which is one of the most egalitarian Christian religions that exists. And so I come at this from a somewhat different viewpoint and struggle with it because we are living in a patriarchal culture which is founded on domination and power. It's not a matriarchal culture which is founded on consensus building and peace-like relationships. But the trick is that you've been addressing tangentially is all of these concepts are embedded in everybody's individual brain, actually from the moment of conception on up. And that's why people act the way they do and don't change, because there's a whole accumulation of neural networks that are saying, if I'm going to survive this society, I have to found my behavior on domination and power. And that's how it just keeps perpetuating. So the question of how to turn that around is a really fundamental one, because it's a whole societal question of how do you turn around a society more towards Bhutan. I mean, the interesting thing is there are cultural examples from way 40,000 years ago of cooperative cultures, matriarchal cultures, of huge cultures that hadn't been historically described before. And so we do actually have an opportunity to look at the history of knowing what those cultures are and how they behave and shifting things that way, but it's going to take a long time. And unfortunately, the worst as we don't have that. So it's going to have to be a lot of intensive education that people receive in order to shift their perception.
So I would say that, you know, I when I can, I teach a course called Policy, Culture and Discourse that shape health and healthcare, right? And so we were touching on it because we were talking about changing the narrative. And so it's changing the language and it's changing how you talk about it, and it's changing, it's because you're right. The rhetoric that we hear, the discourse that we hear, I like to call it, it's like a song, right? It's like we might not even like the song, but when it comes on, we know the lyrics and we will sing them.
Yeah.
Right? And that's kind of how we do, because those grooves, those neural pathways have been shaped and reshaped and reshaped, and so that we have to create other pathways. And so that is about changing the narrative so that we can start having a different conversation, so that we can talk about the violence, that's violence that's happening here, but the domination is about violence. So I wouldn't say that we've skirted it, but we can change it, because if we are changing the narrative and if we're understanding that we have to change that relation. We talked about relationship. It's not about transaction. You know, the dominance is about transaction, and it's not about having relationships to the land and understanding our relationship to the land. That's how I would.
I would also come to this, that it's no mistake that the way that women are evolving in terms of in our leadership and how we're actualizing our voice, and how we are just coming to the place where we don't have the same kinds of barriers that we had a generation ago, right? It's no mistake, and the reaction to that, right? It's not a mistake. And so I think if you are quiet and you pay attention, that it is shifting, right? And there are forces, dominant forces, that are trying to squash it. And what we have to continue to do is do what we know is right. Talk about this from a space of love. Talk about this, that this is violence. Talk about this in relationship to the land. If, and in its language, if we do not call the thing, then we don't know, it makes us crazy. You know that you want your child to have a relationship to the land, get in the garden, right? You know that from your spiritual practice, that how a matriarchal space is, then talk about it. Not just in this space, but every space that you occupy. Because it is in those moments, in those small interactions, that we are able to affect change. As this young person wants to do better, they'll do better because that's their desire. Any
I
questions?
think I saw.
Where?
Over there.
Go ahead, stand up. Stand up. We have time.
We are there. Thank you all for pulling together and for being here. I think, building off a lot of this discussion and question, thinking about, talk a little bit about your experience working with the institution, and to be kind of upfront and for lack of a better expression, like seeing how the sausage is made. I think this theme of or tension around, you could think about it as like incremental versus transformative change, or system change versus I guess incremental again, but how do you kind of balance those things where I'm sure there are ways that UN could be structured differently to have more equitable decision-making power, but that's not what they're there to do. In this case, they're there to tackle climate change, which is an outcome of unequal power structures. And so, yeah, I struggle sometimes with thinking about the climate justice plan. Great plan, but how do we actually get it implemented?
Right.
Well done.
How do we actually get it implemented, and how do we get the policy changed so that we're not continually fighting for these types of equitable outcomes?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because it's something. It is the question. I think we all are reminiscing on this question all the time in the work that we want to do. And yes, like particularly in such a big international process, the agreeing anything takes so long. And so then if you're already working with people who really want to see climate outcomes very quickly and know that we aren't going to get anything very quickly, which basket you put your eggs in becomes really important. However, but it's all part of the same system, right? As you say, it's like you're perpetuating injustice by working in an unjust decision-making process about an unjust problem, and how do you not fight the various injustices on all those levels? And really, if I'm honest, the least developed countries group hasn't devoted a lot of time to thinking through more just ways of making the decision, more just ways of getting the sausage made. Because they are up against so much else, they have so many other priorities, but also the power dynamics even within the group, and then not wanting to upset power dynamics that might get them into other spaces is something that plays out too. Some of fortunately, several of the least developed countries have graduated from this category, even in the time that I've been in the UN. The UN categorizes countries based on criteria, and if you meet those criteria, you graduate out and you become just another country. But yeah, so they also envisioned for themselves that they could be moving to these other spaces, which is great. That no country wants to be a least developed country forever. And so that's another element too, is the hope that there won't be a least developed countries group anymore, which would be awesome. Of course, there have been countries in this category since the 60s, so it's that's a long road too. But there's a lot of different reasons why, and then the biggest thing is that it would never, I'm such a pessimist, but even talking about vulnerability in the UN breaks completely down, because introducing justice in any kind of practical way that countries have to agree on is the surest way to shut that narrative down. Like, it will go away so quickly and everything's consensus. So everybody has to agree on it. And if you know it's gonna go nowhere, even if you're making the right point, what do you do? With the UN, I think is the same thing that you guys face here. Like, so are we again just working on changing the narrative and changing other things? And some of the LDC representatives have really delved into this changing the narrative space of like doing media trainings in English and getting on as many camera platforms as they can to just talk about themselves and their stories to the people, talk directly to the citizens with power, which we have been very happy to help them do in everything we can. But that for them seems a quicker avenue towards raising justice than actually changing the system itself. Which maybe has some resonance here too, but yeah, it is the question.
Yeah, it is the question.
I think I come back to, because when I hear you, I get that headache that I get. Sandra, I got that headache that I get. Because it's hard to be hopeful. So then I'm gonna ask a question that we asked. Was the book a pathway to wellness for you?
Well, it certainly did start that way. In terms of, like, it was just the outpour of like, I have been journaling about Trump's inauguration for 15 days and 14 nights and I can't stop crying. So I might as well like make this story accessible to more people. But then became so much more as I was writing it and weaving all these things together. And now I see it as a similar response of the system we work in is not going to meet the challenge it is, and it's an unjust system about an unjust thing. Maybe I'll just go directly to the people and tell my version of the story in order to change hearts and minds. Like, it was kind of this outpour of another want and channel to make change that I had access to. And yeah, like, so is it a wellness thing for me? It's wellness in that I find meaning in being able to tell this story to hopefully more people who want to listen and hopefully lead towards change we all want. Yes, is it maybe particularly the healthiest thing to do? My therapist probably would disagree about being so vulnerable to so many, but like wanted to do it, and so here I am. So yeah,
Did it help?
It's helped me. I sleep much soundly now, so that's good.
Any question? Please.
I'll stand up and say my name.
Thank you.
I'm Jeff, and part of the Carrie group. First, I just want to thank you for the book, and I'm excited about reading it. And what really sounds exciting is how you how you combine levels from your personal story and the violence in your family to the UN and the world, and and that sounds great. It sounds moving. That because people live in their individual lives, and the problem with climate change is that climate crisis, it can be so abstract for people. And then I also want to thank you for your response to Jeremy, because that's true. Yeah, we can all lower our carbon footprint by 10%, and it won't really matter unless the systems change. And I think that is what Carrie's focused on. And somewhat involved with the legislation team. And there's so many bills that come up, really great bills that come up in front of the Rhode Island legislature. And we endorse a set of them. And it's frustrating. We know most of them are not going to get a vote. They're going to die in committee. There's been one in the last few years to mandate that climate change get taught from 1st to 12th grade. It hasn't made it out of committee. But I do want to sound a little bit of a optimistic or a positive note. In 2020, in the election 2020, a bunch of much more progressive people got elected. Women of color, more progressive men of color. And then in 2021, we finally passed Act on Climate, which is really one of the more progressive, ambitious pieces of legislation in the country. Now, there's a real question whether we're going to meet the goals that were laid out. Right now, the latest report is we're not going to meet them, but the bill says then we can sue. Anybody can sue the state if they don't meet the bills. And then last year we passed 100% renewable energy by 2033, which is the most ambitious in the country. And you know, Rhode Island is small. What we do isn't going to change the world carbon footprint, but I think Rhode Island has a history of leading. You know, from Roger Williams being the first to do separation of church and state. So I feel somewhat proud, even though I know there's hundreds or more things that should be done. But the grassroots organization that you are promoting, that carries one part of, there's a lot of other organizations pushing in the same way. It does make little changes.
Definitely, and thanks for sharing all that and for all the work that you guys do.
Yes, so I have a response.
So one of the challenges REJC has with both of those legislations is that there's no justice in them, right? Or the justice is small, right? And so how we are responding to that is to say, okay, so when we talk about these people who are polluting, we right now today have a polluter in the Port of Providence who wants to expand their footprint. And it's like, dear God, like today you want to do this? No, yes, we want to do it today. And so tomorrow there will be a press conference to talk about that. REJC along with Conservation Law Foundation, which is a very strange coordination of effort, but this is what happens when you're trying to stop, so that polluters cannot come into neighborhoods that are called green justice zones, right? So that's how you bring justice into the legislation, right? So, because activism isn't enough, right? You actually have to be like, oh, so as a person who just lives on Everyday Street, I've got to write. Yes, you do. And you have to maybe work with someone who was your enemy so that you can change a thing. So it's that kind of change that's happening in Rhode Island and in Providence in particular that seems insane, but maybe something will change.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And for us, what has been curious is that the bill that we did not support, that person is supporting our bill. So you want to talk about down is up and up is down. It feels very much like that, but those are the times we're living in.
Yeah. And thanks as well for mentioning this new wave of people entering politics and all this stuff. I think President Trump had some ripple effects that we are still seeing. Like, if he really pushed me to do something I'd never done, who would have thought it? So yeah, like I'm also heartened by the number of people who have put themselves out there in response to like this drastic change. But yeah, that hopefully we do have a new wealth of people putting themselves forward for leadership, changing the narrative, doing all this stuff. Because yeah, I see it as well.
So we have only a few more minutes. So there were hands. Was anyone in the back? No, that's just doing hair. Okay. No, that's okay. The baseball, you had a question, no?
No, I was just wondering if we were wrapping. I mean, I do have questions, but well, I would like to know about the title of the book.
Yes, I didn't come up with the term, but everything that rises. was not mine. Mine was a climate memoir, which got changed to a climate change memoir, so people could understand what it was. But I do like that it does kind of, for me, this is a coming of age story as well, in terms of like, I went in thinking like I would look to these other people, these other systems for solutions, and I end up realizing that we all have to advocate ourselves for the people and the change that we want. And this kind of rise of consciousness is what I think it speaks to, in addition to rising emissions, but that's a lame climate joke. Everything right. Yeah. But thanks.
Was there another hand?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
I just had, more of a comment, I guess, on thinking about the question from our virtual space. And I had the opportunity now to work with college students, and interact with college students regularly, and I am learning about applying the expression, you have to meet people where they're at, right? And I think for a lot of very like young green organizers, I'm learning that you can't just tell them all the things that I know now in my mid-30s about organizing and the complexities of the system and why we have to think about system change and not just individual change. I think it really has to be a yes and, you know, like I think there is, especially for people who are new to the space, I think there has to be space for, you know, that conversation about what is in their sphere of influence as maybe a young person in the world, and how can they, you know, that's because I think that helps fuel and build, and that's a scaffold, and that gets you to stay in the game, so you can get to a point where you're at a protest, or that's not where people start. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think and I love the yes and thing. I use that a lot for like, what do we need to solve climate change? It's like the climate crisis is a yes and problem. We need everything we possibly can. There's no one magic thing. It's a yes and thing, which also means yes and for every person needs to be yes and. But then I do really resonate with like people who are below the age of 18, like so many of the things that we look towards, like your power to vote and your power to get out and like protest, it's like you don't have access to as a young person, particularly the voting, and also divestment. I'm like, I didn't have any money and so what can they do and what can they bring? And like, I feel like there's and channeling that energy and passion to change as well, and imagine solutions that those of us who aren't already jaded by the systems could come up with is something pretty magic. So I really want to see like more narrative and more space that we give to like young people to imagine this space and the future we have, and for us as the adults who are now privileged enough to have access to these collective decision making to channel that into our like our voting and our protesting and our divesting, and really like all be working together in this yes and fashion. So yeah, thanks for talking a bit about that, because that's a lot. There's so much there.
Oh, good, good, okay, and then you, sir.
Diane Hill from Cary. I just want to thank you too. It's been a wonderful discussion, a heartfelt discussion. And I would like to know, as a member of Cary, how we can support our EJC's work and how we can continue the dialogue.
Well, you can talk with me afterwards and we'll talk about that, because we would love to figure out how that could happen. Because we're having strange bedfellows as we move forward. Sir.
Campaign, I think you're absolutely on target for saying we need to change the narrative. The question I have in my mind is, how do we do it? And I've been fortunate to occupy positions very close to the center of power in Providence. I don't despise that. And so that much of the current law is stuff I drafted. And it's not Rhode Island. So in one narrow sphere, that emissions reduction, we're among the top 6 states in the US. And I know that, but I know that the system that we have now is actually not working. And it's almost immune to questions of justice. Because it's not really driven by that, it's driven by questions of profit. And that if we look at Rhode Island's history, we had first one era where profit was made by the exploitation of bodies and animals. Then we had another set of times when it was made by exploitation of whole resources. Then we've had another set of times when it's been done by petroleum, electricity, and fossil fuels. And those systems have proven bankrupt. Every one of them relied on exploitation. That's our real history here. When Samuel Slater started his mill, the employment was 7 women, 5 men, and 52 children. It was a child labor system, and that persisted as dominant in Rhode Island up to the 20th century. So that resolution about how much we relied on exploitation, what you really asked is how is that narrative started to change. But I'm befuddled about how I see that change happening in our own jurisdiction. And that's my closing personal question. So thank you.
I'd say that the main some of the work that I do is really talking about how we all have skin in the game. Okay, because if you keep doing profit, you think that you're winning and you think that you're making something, but again, it's understanding that the inequalities that we see is what makes us sick. You know, the US has the most disparities of all the developed countries. And we have the worst health outcomes across income. Right? So that's where the idea that us kind of trying to say, oh, you know, those poor vulnerable people, well, that's not me. You know, the fact that you've created the system means that it's you, that you are impacted. So that's where changing the narrative is, because we have a system that makes us think that it's somebody else and it's not us. Well, you.
Yeah, I'm finished, I'm sorry. I know, I'm sorry. But I also think that it's what I said earlier, you know this history. You know so many people who don't know this history. You have to tell this history every place that you occupy. Right, you're talking to the hallelujah chorus here, right? But there are places that you occupy that don't know this history. And so it's on you, right, to talk about it. Like I said to Greg, it's important for you to be a yes, as you talk about justice in this space. You know, it only works until wealthy people start talking about poverty, right? Men start talking about misogyny and sexism, right? White people start talking about racism because it affects all of us. And we have this disconnect to think that it's you all. That's the lie. That's the problem, right? And until, you know, the narrative doesn't change by the 3 of us, the narrative changes by you taking responsibility. When you have information, tell it. I almost want to tell the Trump story I told, but I'm not going to tell it. Okay, but you know what I mean? Like, we're human and we all live on the rock, and the rock is not going to exist until we change the way that we're moving. And that's really the thing.
We're about out of time.
I know. Thank you.
For you a gift, if you are interested in the book and would like a discount, I have a postcard for you with a discount to the book, 25% off. So yeah.
Thank you to everybody.
See you.
Love to help.
Yes.
Yes, she is,